Recently, I acquired Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoners Soul Hackers for the 3DS, and the blurb on the back of the box caught my eye. The missing entry in the classic Shin Megami Tensei trademark RPG series finally arrives in North America. If you're aware of Megaten's history with localization, you probably already know what I'm about to say. Calling Soul Hackers the missing entry is probably the biggest back of the box lie I've ever heard, considering how many Megaten games sit without translations. So I thought to myself, just how many Megaten games are actually localized and can be easily accessed, and how many can't? Turns out, that's a lot. But let's establish some ground rules. 1. This is covering the entire Megaten franchise, so each subseries is fair game. If you're unsure what the difference is, Maka has a fantastic video covering this topic. I highly recommend you watch it. 2. Only official translations and releases. The Megaten and ROM hacking communities have offered great support for SMT games. If I was counting those, our total number would be much lower. I will be noting when games have fan translations or an effort in progress, but they will still count as untranslated for consistency's sake. And 3. No mobile phone games. If I did those, I'd be here forever. Feel free to disagree as much as you want. I'm not the final authority on this subject. But without further ado, let's get started. What better place to start than the original Megami Tensei series? First game in the franchise, Megami Tensei, is odd. It's not made by Atlas. That's right, the first game in this franchise we love was actually made by Telenet, a company who appears to be mostly known for pachinko games on the SNES and these two horrifying looking golf games. The game itself is a pretty far cry from the series we know today. It's a top-down dungeon crawler RPG similar to Gauntlet, as I'm told, though the game is not entirely foreign to us as the game does feature the moon phase system, which we've seen in almost every game since. The game actually had quite a few releases, 4 to be precise. The first release was for the MSX, a home computer system, in July of 1987. A month later, in August, the PC 8801 and the X1 also received versions of the game with updated graphics, which I have to say hurt my eyes like mad. And finally, one more month later, the FM7 received its own version of the game with slightly altered graphics from the previous version. None of these games have any English translation to speak of. But the games are fairly light on text, so it's very possible that you could muscle your way through it. If you want to play any of these games, you're going to be in for a time. You'd have to acquire a working version of one of the 4 computers and a copy of the game. I searched high and low, and I was only able to find one copy of the MSX version on eBay. It cost $64, which is an okay price, I guess. As for the other versions, I couldn't find a single listing for them. The next game in the Megami Tensei series is Megami Tensei, but it's not the one I just finished talking about. This is the version of Megami Tensei that was developed by Atlas. If you've played old SMT games, you will probably feel much more comfortable here. As the rest of the series, this game is a first-person dungeon crawler with demon recruiting. The game was released for the Famicom on September 11th of 1987, just a few months after the first version of the Telenet game. The game has had a few re-releases since. The game was ported to mobile phones in 2004, but the game's content was reduced. The game also received a Super Famicom remake, which will be addressed later. And lastly, is also available on the Switch as DLC for the Namco Collection, but this DLC is only available in Japan and South Korea, and as such is not translated. However, not all is lost on the translation front. There's a full English translation out there. If you want a physical copy of this game, it doesn't seem too hard to find. The eBay listings I came across started around $40 for boxed copies. Also, can I just complain about both versions of these games having almost identical cover art? It makes researching them very annoying. Next up is Megami Tensei 2, released on April 6th of 1990 for the Famicom. It's much like its predecessor. It's mainly a first-person dungeon crawler with demon recruiting. Though this game also features a top-down view when outside dungeons, similar to most JRPGs of the time. Anyways, this game also was the first in the franchise to feature multiple endings. Much like Megami Tensei 2 has a few re-releases. It received a mobile phone port, which unfortunately removed or changed the majority of the music. Also, like the first game, Megami Tensei 2 was featured in a remake collection for the Super Famicom, which again will be addressed later. None of these releases were in English, so once again we turn to the fanzine for help. Unfortunately, there's not a finished translation. If you'd like to acquire a copy of the game yourself, it'll run you a minimum of $50. Remember when I said that both Megami Tensei 1 and 2 received remakes on the Super Famicom? Well, it's time to expand on that. Kyoyaku Megami Tensei was released on March 31st of 1995. As I've said already, Kyoyaku features remakes of both Famicom and Megami Tensei games. both of which are fairly faithful, with minimal changes and a few new features. The game also features interactions between the saves of the first game and the second, mostly involving decisions made in Megami Tensei 1 affecting side quests in Megami Tensei 2, which is very cool. In addition to the Super Famicom release, the game also saw a release in the Japanese Wii Virtual Console, which unfortunately no longer exists. As you might have surmised, there is no official English release for this game, but once again the fan community comes to the rescue. Thanks to DDS translations, both games are fully translated in English. If you want to get a hold of this game, it's a bit more pricey than the others. Most of the listings I came across were in the $80 to $100 range. And that's the entirety of the original Megami Tensei series. Unfortunately, the entirety of it is unplayable by normal means in the Westernosphere, but a lot of fan groups have stepped up and done the work and made a majority of them playable in one form or another. Let's get started on the core franchise. We've been getting Shin Megami Tensei games since the 90s, but we only have 9 of them. Don't worry about how the most recent game is numbered with a 5. First up is Shin Megami Tensei. Originally released for the Super Famicom on October 30th, 1992, this is the start of the main series we know today, featuring all the staples, the moon phases, alignments, and demon recruiting. SMT1 has had the luxury of having several re-releases and enhanced re-releases over the years. A year after its Super Famicom release, it saw another release on the Turbo CD, otherwise known as the TurboGrafx 16. A year later, it was released for the Sega CD. This version has a few upgrades from the previous, such as minor voiceover and an on-screen map, as well as updated graphics. And I have to say, Pascal is looking incredibly boofy, and I love him. 7 years after that, there was a remake release for the PlayStation 1. The main differences here were that the dungeons were fully rendered in 3D, but the music suffers. 2 more years after that, there's another enhanced re-release, this time for the Game Boy Advance. While this version does have minor differences from the Super Famicom version, they aren't really worth listing. 4 years after this, we have our first digital release on the Wii Virtual Console, which unfortunately has shut down. 3 years after that, the PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, and PlayStation Vita received a digital copy of the PS1 version of the game. 2 years after that, the GBA version was ported to iOS and Android, and 8 years after that, the Super Famicom version was released on the Nintendo Switch Online service. Out of all these releases, only one was officially translated, and unfortunately, it was the iOS version, which is no longer playable due to lack of updates for current Apple products and being delisted. So, unless you happen to have an old iOS device that already has the game on it, you won't be playing it anytime soon. Or so you'd think. Thanks to the ever-present Megaten community, the SNES version has been fully translated into English, as has the GBA port using the official script from the iOS version. Translation for the PS1 version also just dropped while I was writing this video. If you want to secure a physical copy of the game for yourself, you have several options. The Super Famicom version can be found fairly cheap online, starting around $20. For the Turbo CD, I couldn't find any listing whatsoever. The Sega CD version of the game runs $60 at a minimum, usually higher. The PS1 version is cheaper, starting around $30 or $40. I was unable to find listings for the GBA port on eBay, but copies of it on Yahoo Auction are running around 4,300 yen. Next up, Shin Megami Tensei 2. SMT2 was originally released on March 18th, 1994 for the Super Famicom and is very similar to its predecessor, with a few notable differences: an easier to access auto map feature, magic inheritance for fusions, and being able to control party demons. 8 years after the original release, the PlayStation 1 received a remake in a similar vein to the SMT1 remake. Another year after that, the Game Boy Advance received a port of the SNES version of the game. Are you sensing a pattern here? 7 years after that, the PlayStation 3, PSP, and PS Vita all received a digital port of the PlayStation version of the game. And a month after that, the Wii Virtual Console also received a SNES port. 2 more years after that, the iOS and the Android also got ports, and 9 years after that, the game came to Nintendo Switch's online service. And these ports have been made available in English, though English speakers can still access the Nintendo Switch version of the game. But thankfully, once again, the community has released a full translation of the Super Famicom version. If you're looking to pick up a physical copy, a Famicom copy of the game will probably run you $30 or more. PS1 copies of the game run at a bit higher cost, down to around 50. Game Boy Advance copies seem to be much more expensive, starting at 13,200 yen. Shin Megami Tensei If is the next on our list, originally released on October 28th, 1994 for the Super Famicom. If is the first spin-off game that's still considered part of the mainline series without branching into its own franchise, though it did become the inspiration for Persona, and we all know how well that's going. 8 years after the original release, there was an enhanced re-release for the PlayStation 1, which added several features, among them new 3D graphics and new easy difficulty and various quality of life features. 8 years after that, the PS1 version got digital release on the PlayStation 3, PSP, and Vita. A year later, the SNES version came to the Wii Virtual Console. A few years after that, the SNES version was ported to iOS. 8 more years after that, and the game came to Nintendo Switch Online. Unfortunately, all these ports have never been officially released in English, but as has been the case, If has been translated by the fan base. If you're looking to nab a physical copy of If, you can get a Super Famicom copy starting around $25. If you're looking for a PS1 copy, that runs a bit higher, starting around $45. Before we move on from the Super Famicom games, if you do a little digging, you might find indications of PC versions of SMT1, 2, If, as well as the first Majin Tensei game. Series we'll talk about later. These were ports of the Super Famicom versions, but they weren't ports in the traditional sense. They were through a service called iRevo, which, as far as I can tell from the small amount of information on English sites, is that it was a sort of sanctioned emulation service. Unfortunately, this service was discontinued as of 2011. Next is probably one of the lesser known SMT games, Shin Megami Tensei 9. I didn't know about it until very recently. It's no big surprise considering it was only released in Japan and was exclusive to the original Xbox, which sold noticeably poorly in Japan, and consequently, the game itself sold worse, dropping out of the top 50 games after only 3 weeks. There's absolutely no way of playing this game short of acquiring an Xbox and a copy of the game yourself. You're expecting me to do some total shift and say, but there's a fan translation you can play right now. I can only say I'm sorry and that you're out of luck. While a translation sort of exists, it's not of the game, but the script itself, and it's only partial, only covering 2 of the 9 routes. So there is a fan translation patch in progress. Sadly, it doesn't look like we'll have a fully translated version of this game anytime soon. If you're looking to get a copy of 9, you'll be dropping at least $30 or $40 for the base version, or over $150 for the deluxe pack. Phew! Those last few sections were real downers, huh? At least the rest of the mainline series should be a straight shot, right? Right? Let's get into it. Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne is pretty easy to get a hold of right now. You can grab the recent HD release on PC, Switch, and PS4 for $30. If you want my personal opinion, you should grab the PC version, but that's just me. If you have qualms about the HD remaster, which, if you do, is fair, you do have one more option. The original US release of Shin Megami Tensei 3 is available for download on the PlayStation Store. But there's a catch. It can only be downloaded on the PlayStation 3. So if you're planning on picking them up, you may want to do that as soon as possible, as Sony is in the process of phasing out the PlayStation 3 store. Also, getting a PS3 is a really good investment if you want to get Megaten games, which I'll talk more about later. Next up is another fairly unknown game, Shin Megami Tensei Imagine, otherwise known as Shin Megami Tensei Online. Yes, SMT had an MMO. Now, if you've been picking up on patterns, you may already be suspecting that the game was not localized, but to my surprise, it was. Imagine was released in late 2008 as a free-to-play game and ran for a good 6 years before being shut down in 2014. Not a very long time as MMOs go. So you think that'd be it? It's shut down and can't be played anymore. Well, normally that would be the end, but not in this case. Thanks to the Reimagine project, the MMO is still playable, even with new content and events, and even some content that never made it to the Western release, since those servers weren't shut down until 2 years after the American ones. Next up is Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey, a fan favorite. It was originally released for the Nintendo DS in America in 2010, and later an enhanced re-release for the Nintendo 3DS. The original release isn't very easy to find, new that is, and even used it will run you a pretty penny. The Redux version, on the other hand, is a bit easier to get a hold of comparatively. I was able to get a hold of a new copy for a little over $60, which is still a high price. If you don't want to pay that high of a price and would prefer a digital copy of the game, you can pick it up on the 3DS eShop for $40. I feel it bears mentioning that the 3DS eShop may be going down as soon as next year, and when it does, any and all DLC for 3DS Megaten games will be unable to be obtained. After that, Shin Megami Tensei 4, which is still fairly easy to get, thankfully. I got my new copy for a little under $50, with used copies running around the same price. Again, if you're indifferent to having a physical copy of the game, you can just save a lot of money by picking it up digitally for only $20. Much like Strange Dirty Redux, if you want access to the game and its DLC, I urge you to pick them up as soon as possible, in case Nintendo does pull the 3DS store down like they've been hinting at. Last of the 3DS mainline games is Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse. My new copy cost me $90, with both used and new copies tending to average around that. Some being a little lower, some being a little higher. As was the case with the previous 3DS games, the eShop comes to the rescue once again. You can get Apocalypse running for only $30. Once again, it does have DLC, so if you are interested in those, Pick them up as soon as possible. And the last of the mainline games is Shin Megami Tensei 5, which came out fairly recently, so conversely, it's probably the easiest game in the series to get a hold of, with the possible exception the Nocturne Remaster or some of the digital releases. It's running a bit under normal full game price at the time of this writing. It also has some DLC, but I wouldn't worry about having that archived till at least the Switch is phased out. Well, that's the main series I'll cover. That took a while. How many of these do I have left to do? Five? Five whole sub-series? Not to mention a bunch of 1 or 2 off series? Not to mention the script is already at 2,000 words. I'm gonna be here forever, aren't I? Well, better get going then. Next up is the Last Bible series, which takes place in a more common fantasy setting. The first game of the series, Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible, was originally released on Christmas Day 1992 for the original Game Boy. 2 years later, the Sega Game Gear received a port. This version of the game features a few differences, such as new sprites for monsters and characters, as well as a new ending and boss. 5 years later, the Game Boy Color got a port of the Game Boy version specifically, meaning the new sprites and features from the Game Gear version are absent. 13 years later, the 3DS Virtual Console saw a release of the game as well, and 8 years after that, the Game Gear Micro was released and contained the game on the red versions of the console. This game actually has a Western release. The Game Boy Color version of the game was released in America as Revelations, the Demon Slayer. If you want to get a hold of this version of the game, it's going to cost you a pretty penny. I couldn't find a single listing for it that wasn't over $100. If you want the untranslated Game Boy version, that's significantly cheaper, running around $15. The Game Gear version of the game is much more expensive, landing around $80. If you are interested in playing the Game Gear version of the game, there is a fan translation for that out there. The second game in the series, Last Bible 2, was released on November 19th, 1993 for the original Game Boy. Much like the first game, 6 years later, it received a Game Boy Color port. 13 years later, the color version was ported to the 3DS Virtual Console. And unfortunately, there's no official English release for this game, but thankfully there's a fan translation for the game out there. Next up is another Bible. It was the first spin-off from the Last Bible series. As is usually the case with spin-offs, the genre is different. This game is much closer to an SRPG, like Fire Emblem or Atlas's own Majin Tensei series, which we'll talk about later. It was originally released on March 3rd, 1995 for the Game Boy, and then again 13 years later, it was remade for mobile phones by BBMF. If you want to get a hold of the Game Boy version, it's a bit expensive, running around $60 or more. Last Bible 3 was the last numbered entry in the series, and also dropped the Megami Tensei Gaiden precursor in the title. It's also the first Megaten game I played. Not that I played very much of it, not being in English and all. The game was originally released on March 4th, 1995 for the Super Famicom, then 16 years later it was released on the Wii Virtual Console. And as has been the trend, there is no official English release. If you want to get a copy of it yourself, it'll run roughly $40 to $60. If you want to experience the story yourself, once again, there's a fan translation out there. Last Bible Special was the last non-mobile phone Last Bible game. It eschewed the Western fantasy setting that the games had been using up to this point for a more biblical setting, with the story centering on the city of Jerusalem. The game was originally released on March 24th, 1995 for the Sega Game Gear. 15 years after that, it was included on the red version of the Game Gear Micro, much like the first Last Bible game. If you want a physical copy of this game, it won't be cheap. Most copies I've come across are running at least $80. If you want to experience the story, there is a fan translation available. Well, that's all the Last Bible games. It's what I would like to say, but there's a bit of a special circumstance. Last Bible New Testament was originally released through various mobile phone services back in 2007 and 2008. And if you remember my qualifiers, you'd think, hey, isn't this outside of what you said you'd cover? Ordinarily, you'd be right. Earlier this year, the game was announced to be coming to the Switch through a publisher called Gmode. The game is now out on the eShop for 1,800 yen, or $13. Of course, it's not translated, but it's something to keep in mind. Now we're done with the Last Bible games. For real this time. No more debates. Next on the docket are the Majin Tensei games, Atlas's own strategy RPG series. Think Fire Emblem in a modern day setting with a Megami Tensei twist. The first game, simply titled Majin Tensei, was one of the first spin-offs from the main series, releasing only 2 years after Shin Megami Tensei, the same year as its sequel Shin Megami Tensei 2. First released on January 28th, 1994, and then 17 years later on the Wii Virtual Console. Unfortunately, as is the story with many older SRPGs, there wasn't an official English release. If you want to get a physical copy, it's actually not too expensive, with most copies starting around $20. If you want to enjoy the story, there is a full English fan translation. Also, just as a side note, can I say the vibes of the opening screens of this game are off the charts? The next game in the series, aptly titled Majin Tensei 2, The Spiral Nemesis, originally released on February 19th, 1995 for the Super Famicom, and then again 16 years later on the Wii Virtual Console. And as you may have guessed, much like the first game, it hasn't had an official Western release. If you want to grab a copy of it, it'll cost you a bit more than the first game. Every listing I came across was over $100. Also similar to the first game, it has a full English translation. The last game in the Majin Tensei series is Roan, though this is disputed. For the Sega Saturn of all things, back in the late 90s, Atlas seemed to really go in on the Saturn, releasing 3 different games on it. This might seem odd from a Western perspective because we know the Saturn as a pretty spectacular failure. It was still a failure in Japan, but much less so, lasting a good 6 years on the Japanese market compared to the 3 years it got in America and Europe. Even if the Saturn's numbers were better in Japan, that didn't really help Round, which reviewed pretty poorly as far as I can tell. The game famously released a demo, and said demo resulted in large cancellations of pre-orders for the game. As you might suspect, the game has never been re-released. If you want to own Roand for some reason, it does seem fairly easy to get a hold of, starting around $15. As you may have surmised, there isn't even a fan's translation of this game. Sort of. There is actually a translation of the script by Twitch streamer Your Pal Snowdrop, and if I'm honest, this is probably the closest we'll get to experiencing the game. But that's all the Majin Tensei games, aside from the mobile ones, but we'll save those for another time. It's a pity that the whole series never saw a stateside release, considering its later crossover with Fire Emblem and a second strategy duology, which we'll talk about later. And now it's time to talk about the series that prompted this entire video, the Devil Summoner series. The series is currently made up of 2 different sub-series. The mainline Devil Summoner series, which takes place in the futuristic year of 1990X, with a cyberpunk aesthetic and uses the classic battle system. The other series is the Raido Kuzunoha series, which takes place in the Taisho period in Japan and features an action battle system, not unlike that of the Tales of series. But the one single through line that the series has is that they're all mystery stories. The first game in the series is of course Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner. It was also the start of Atlas releasing games on the Sega Saturn. Unfortunately for the time being, it is the only game in the series that you cannot play in English. It was originally released on Christmas 1995 and then received a PSP port in 2005, 10 years later. The PSP port has a few differences, such as having the Demon Compendium, a new hard difficulty, and 4 new bosses. As I mentioned earlier, the game has no official Western release, though there is a fan translation in the works for the PSP by CJ Iwakura. The other game in the Devil Summoner's duology is Devil Summoner Soul Hackers, the very game that prompted the writing of this video. Like the first Devil Summoner game, Soul Hackers was initially released for the Sega Saturn, then had subsequent releases on the PlayStation, and then a remake on the 3DS. Again, like the first Devil Summoners game, Soul Hackers is set in a cyberpunk-ish future. Thankfully, unlike its predecessor, Soul Hackers can be played in English, thanks to the 3DS remake, which even goes so far as to include an English dub as well. If you're thinking about picking it up, you have 2 options. I got my new physical copy for $65. If you prefer a digital copy, that can be acquired for a small price of $20. So, when I said Devil Summoners was a duology, I may have been lying. When I originally wrote this section, it was true, but during the time between the first draft and the second draft, Atlas announced Soul Hackers 2, dropping both the Shin Megami Tensei moniker and the Devil Summoners sub-series. Probably because Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoners Soul Hackers 2 would be a bit silly, but I digress. As of writing, the game has yet to release, but it is slated for multiple regions and pre-orders as setting at a full price of $60 plus DLC. The other half of the Devil Summoner series is the Raido Kuzunoha sub-series. First game, Devil Summoner Raido Kuzunoha vs. the Soulless Army, was released for the PlayStation 2, and then eventually a digital version was released on the PlayStation 3 in America. If you're interested in playing it, a PS2 copy will run you at the very least $150. However, if you have a PS3, you can pick up a digital copy for the low price of $10. The second Raido game, Devil Summoner 2 Raido Kuzunoha vs. King of Abaddon, like its predecessor, was also released on the PS2 and then had a later digital release on the PS3 in America. If you want to play this one, a PS2 disc is roughly $60 if you can find one. Otherwise, it'll be around $300 for a collector's edition, which seems more common. But if you have a PS3, you can get the digital re-release for $10. And that's all the Devil Summoner games. A nice 75% of them are playable in English. And for not too much too, assuming you have access to the consoles that the games got digital releases on. And even then, some of those consoles can be picked up for cheaper than individual copies of some of these games. The next series is the big dog of the Megaten sub-series, that's right, Persona, a series that core Megaten fans love to hate, the series that anime fans love. But you have to admit, the series is successful, to say the least. I would go into more detail in this intro bit, but odds are you already know Persona, and there's a lot of them to get through. Megami Ibunroku Persona, or Revelations Persona, as it was released in America after a heavy censorship, or as most know it now, Persona 1. Originally released in the West in 1996, Persona launched on Sony's PlayStation. Then a few years later, there was a Japan-only PC release. 10 years later, an enhanced release was put out for the PSP, and then finally the original American release was made available again on Sony's ill-fated PlayStation Classic. If you want to play Persona 1, you're going to be in a tough position. If you're insisting on playing the censored version released on the PS1, I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but I'm covering my bases. PS1 disc is running, now sit down, from $300 to $500 on Amazon or eBay. There is one other option, as I mentioned earlier. The censored version of Persona 1 was also featured on the PlayStation Classic, which only runs around $50. But that does mean you'll have to play on a PlayStation Classic, which has its own set of problems that I won't get into here. That only leaves the PSP remake, which most people consider the definitive version, which unfortunately is running around $100 for a physical copy. But thankfully, the PSP was a console with a digital storefront, so it can be acquired for a small amount of money on either a PS3 or a PSP console. Persona 2 Innocent Sin, or simply Persona 2 Sin, as it was released in Japan, is the second game in the Persona series and the first game in the Persona 2 duology. It was originally released for the PlayStation back in 1999 in Japan. The West wouldn't see anything of this game until 12 years later with the PSP Enhanced re-release. An English physical copy of the remake can run you anywhere from $70 to $150. But if physical isn't a big sticking point, you can get it from the PSP Digital Store. I feel like at this point I should mention that there are a few differences from the original PlayStation release, all of which are positive. If you've heard of any of them, it's one of the big bads having some nice shades and a very minor name change. There is also a fan translation of the PlayStation 1 version. Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, or simply Persona 2 Punishment, is the second half of the Persona 2 duology. It follows one of the characters from Innocent Sin, Maya, as she solves a mystery related to a plot point from the previous game. It was originally released in 2000, a year after the first game. Surprisingly, the West actually received a localization for the PlayStation release. Eternal Punishment, like its predecessor, also received a PSP Enhanced remake, but this one was never released stateside due to unusual circumstances. It has also just received a fan translation. If you want to get a copy of the PlayStation 1 release, you'll have to shell out several hundred to $1,000. But if you still want to play it, the PlayStation Digital Store has come to the rescue once again. You can find it on the PS3 and PSP Digital Store for around $10. Persona 3 is the first in the series to be released on the PlayStation 2, and the first in the series to use the social simulation aspect that the series is now known for. It has quite a few additions to choose from. Base Persona 3 was released in 2007 in America for the PlayStation 2. If you want to get a hold of this specific version, the game will cost you between $100 and $200. A year later in 2008, an enhanced re-release of Persona 3 called Persona 3 FES was released, adding new personas, new quests, a hard mode, a 30-hour epilogue, and most importantly, the ability to walk Koromaru the dog. If you're looking for a copy of Persona 3, this is most likely the version that you'll come across. If you want to snag a physical copy of this game, it runs somewhere between $30 and $70 depending on the condition. You can pick it up from the PlayStation 3 Network Store for around $10. There's one more version of Persona 3 you might want to consider if you're planning on playing Persona 3. Persona 3 Portable was released for the PSP in 2010. There's a lot of differences between FES and portable versions that you should be aware of when choosing. First off, Portable does not feature the answer. That's the 30-hour epilogue that FES added. The cutscene presentation and city navigation have been switched out from 3D models to a more visual novel-styled presentation. The dungeons have remained as they were in the PlayStation 2 version, though they do have a decreased level of graphical fidelity. You might be thinking, this sounds like a straight downgrade. Well, that's a fair thought. There are a few perks to playing the portable version. The biggest one that is you can actually control your party members in battle, which is something that you could not do for some reason in the original. There are also some extra bosses. Most importantly, this game allows you to select your character's gender, which every game should do, don't at me. If you want to play Persona 3 Portable, a physical copy will run you $100 to $300, or you can pick up a digital copy in the PlayStation 3 store for $20. Once again, Atlas has ups in my writing process. Persona 3 Portable has been announced for Xbox One, Series X, PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and PC platforms. Unfortunately, we don't know if these ports will be modified at all, and we do not know the release date, aside from them being sometime in 2023. We don't know how much the cost will be. I'm hoping for a lower cost. I think a safe assumption will be $20 to $30. Persona 4 is where the series really started breaking through to the mainstream. It was released for the PlayStation 2 in 2008, follows the example set by Persona 3 with some noticeable improvements, mainly being able to control your party members in battle. If you want to play this version of the game, a physical copy will run you $40-ish, or you can pick it up digitally on the PlayStation Store for $10. However, as is the trend, there is an enhanced re-release. Persona 4 Gold was originally released for the PlayStation Vita in 2012, and then 8 years later it was released on Steam. Golden brought a lot of changes to Persona 4, the most important ones being 2 new social links, a new dungeon, a new bad ending, and new difficulty levels. The PC port brought even more changes, but this time on the technical side, adding a 4K resolution option and a customizable difficulty. Again, another thing that all games should have. A physical Vita copy will run you anywhere from $70 to $200. A digital copy on the PlayStation Store or Steam will both run you $20. And last, we come to Persona 5, the most recent new entry in the series. It was released in 2016 for both the PlayStation 3 and 4. Though the game suffered a long development cycle and many delays, it was received incredibly well and brought the series fully into the mainstream. If you want to play the original Persona 5, you can get physical copies of both the PS3 and PS4 versions for $20 each, and the same for digital copies. And of course, there is an enhanced re-release, Persona 5 Royale. Persona 5 Royale was released in 2020 for the PS4 and added a large amount of new content, including true new confidants, a new dungeon, new personas, and an entire third semester. If you want to pick up Persona 5 Royale, you can get a physical copy for $30 or $60 on digital. And for the final time, hopefully, Atlas has made me make last minute edits to my script. Persona 5 Royal, much like Persona 3 Portable, has been announced for Xbox One, Series X, PS5, Nintendo Switch, and PC platforms. This version of the game also has a release date, currently is set to release it on October 21st, 2022. We don't know the cost, but I'm going to assume it'll be a full $60. Now, you may be saying, Alex, what about these Persona games? I know, I was getting to those. Anyway, now it's time for the
Persona Spin-off Power Hour.
I'll be going fast, so hold on. Megami Tensei Persona Digital Collection, a media game collection that's set after the events of the first Persona game. It was released for PC in 1998. As far as I can tell, there's no way to buy it. There is a listing for it on My Abandonware, though. There are no complete translations. Persona 4 Arena, a direct sequel to both Persona 3 and 4, is a fighting game. You can get it on PS3 and Xbox 360 for $30 to $70 or $20 digitally. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, a sequel to the previous Arena game. Like the previous, it was a fighting game released for both the PS3 and Xbox 360. Prices range from $40 to $150. In March of 2022, the game saw a re-release on Switch, PS4, and PC for $30. Persona 5 Striker is a direct sequel to Persona 5 using combat similar to the Warriors games. It was released on PS4, Switch, and PC. Its price ranges from $30 to $60. Persona 4 Dancing All Night, a rhythm game with a full story taking place after Persona 4. It was released on the Vita with a PS4 digital release later. Costs range from $30 to $100. It's available in a 3-pack with the other 2 dancing games for $60. Also, Hatsune Miku is in this game. Praise her name. Persona 3 Dancing Moonlight is another rhythm game featuring the Persona 3 cast and music. It was released for the PS4 and Vita. Copies goes for $30 to $60. Persona 5 Dancing Star is the third and final Persona rhythm game, this time featuring the Persona 5 cast released for the PS4 and Vita. Copies go from $30 to $60. I should note, both the Persona 3 and Persona 5 dancing games do not have a story mode. Persona Q Shadow of the Labyrinth, released on 3DS as a crossover between Persona 3 and Persona 4 using the dungeon crawling gameplay of Etrian Odyssey. Physical copies run about $40, a digital copy will cost $20. Persona Q, New Cinema Labyrinth, is like the previous game, but this time the Persona 5 crew is added to the mix. A physical copy will run you $80 or more, a digital copy is $40. Well, that's the end of the
Persona Spin-off Power Hour.
I hope you learned something. I sure did. It's that there are way too many Persona games. All jokes aside, I do love the Persona games, and you can play almost all of them in English pretty easily, which is good by my metric. The next series is the only one that's aimed at kids, and was sort of Atlas's answer to Pokemon, Devil Children. Or as it was localized, Demi-Kids. While the series does have many similarities to Pokemon, such as monster collecting, trading, and releasing 2 versions of most of the games with different demons in each, that said, there are many things that are different, like each version having a unique player character and story that takes place parallel to the story in the alternate version. The first game set in the Devil Children series is Devil Children Black Book and Devil Children Red Book. They were first released in 2000 for the Game Boy Color. Each game stars an orphan, Kai for Black Book and Kaname for Red Book. Each of them receive a guardian demon, a Cerberus for Kai, and a griffin for Kaname. 2 years after its initial release, they received a remake for the PlayStation. This remake is without a doubt the definitive way to play the games. It features both games, the ability to trade between both games, Nintendo please take notes, more save slots, voice acting, and new demons. Unfortunately, the games don't seem easy to find physical copies of. I checked Amazon, eBay, and Japan Yahoo Auction and found nothing. However, not all hope is lost. If you have a Japanese PlayStation account, you can find the PlayStation version on the stores for the PS3, PSP, and Vita. Or if you have a Japanese Nintendo account, you can get a copy of the Game Boy Color version on the 3DS eShop. Keep in mind, these versions won't be translated. If you're looking for a translation, however, there is a complete translation for Black Book out there on the internet. Second game in the series is Devil Children White Book, released in 2001. Judging by the name, you'd think it'd be a combo game like Pokemon Emerald. While I wouldn't blame you for thinking that, you'd still be wrong. White Book is a direct sequel to both Black Book and Red Book, taking place a short time after the previous games, featuring a new main character, Kuzuha. Not much has changed since the previous gameplay-wise, the only difference being some new demons and the addition of dying spells. As was the case with the previous game, this one also seems very hard to find copies of, though I was actually able to find a listing for a copy on Yahoo Auction that had sold for about $15. There are no translation patches, but there is a script translation languishing on a Dropbox account I found while searching. The next game in the series is another duology of games, Dimmy Kid's Light version and Dimmy Kid's Dark version. As you might guess from the title, these ones were in fact released in the West and had to be sanitized, though they're still called demons in the game. Good thing it never hit the mainstream because parents would have had a meltdown. It straight up has Lucifer in it. Like the previous games, each version has a different protagonist, Jin for the light version and Akira for the dark version. Gameplay has remained the same, but there is an interesting caveat. The difficulty is different between each version, dark being the harder and light being the easier, so if you want to be a capital G gamer, you gotta play the dark version. If you want to get physical copies of these games, they're going to cost you a pretty penny, from $100 to $800. The third set of duologies in the Devil Children series is Devil Children Firebook and Devil Children Icebook, released in 2003. Unlike the previous games, these two retain the protagonists from the previous games. This time Jin being the leading character in Firebook and Akira being the lead in Icebook. If you want to get a hold of these, you'll have to import, but as has been the trend for this series, they're really hard to find. I was able to find a copy on Yahoo Auction with the current winning bid sitting at $150. As for a translation, the entire script has been translated, but hasn't been released, and the most recent update I've seen on it is from 2008. So, it's dead. At this point, the series takes a weird turn. The next game, Devil Children Puzzle Day Call, is a prime example. Puzzle Day Call was released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003. Instead of featuring the human characters from the previous games, this one focuses on their demon companions. But the real point of diversion is that the game is a puzzle game, not an RPG. It's a Sokoban-style game, a game where you push blocks to reveal an exit. Of course, this game is more than that, featuring step minimums and boss fights, but more or less this is just the Puzzle Boy minigame from SMT3 with extra steps. If you want to get a hold of a copy of it, it might be a bit hard to find. The listings I found on eBay were running about $100. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, there is no translation for this game, though that probably wouldn't serve much of an issue since the gameplay is more or less self-explanatory. There's one last console Devil Children game, Devil Children Messiah Rider. Messiah Rider was released in 2004 for the Game Boy Advance. You might be asking, did they go back to the RPGs after that weird puzzle game? Nope. Messiah Rider is a real-time strategy game on the Game Boy Advance. I don't know about you, but that seems like a really bad idea. But here we are. If you want a copy of this game, a cartridge will run you around $100. Fortunately, the game is also lacking in translation. While I suppose you could try to brute force menus, I feel like the sheer amount of text would make this game borderline unplayable, unless you know how it works already. So that's the Devil Children series. We haven't heard anything from this series since the release of a mobile game in 2011. I honestly don't see this series getting new games or re-releases, since we haven't heard of them in a good 10 plus years. That's all the big series covered. The only series left now are duologies and the one-offs.
Rend, slaughter, devour your enemies. There is no other way to survive. You cannot escape your hunger, warriors of purgatory.
Next up is Digital Devil Saga, or the Avatar Tuner series. These two games were released under the Shin Megami Tensei series name in the US to hopefully drive sales. The series does deviate quite a bit from the established Shin Megami Tensei formula. The games take place in a futuristic dystopia rather than modern times or a post-apocalypse. It also has persistent party members, which has quite a lot of ripples throughout the features. Since there are persistent party members, that means there are no recruitable demons, reducing them to just enemies. And since there are no recruitable demons, that means there's no demon fusion, instead of replacing growth with the mantra system. The first game in the duology, Digital Devil Saga, was released for the PlayStation 2 and released in 2005, and it establishes the game's setting. The game is built on the same engine as Shin Megami Tensei 3, so a lot of assets are reused. This game is actually fairly easy to get a hold of due to it not being super popular. PS2 copy will run you around $30, or if you prefer a digital copy, you can get that in a PlayStation 3 store for $10. Digital Devil Saga 2 was also released in 2005, and also was for the PlayStation 2. Since these games are more or less two halves of the same whole, it takes place immediately following the conclusion of the previous game. That said, the game does boast some new features, a way to increase the party stats, and a half-demon transformation called Berserk Mode. As with the previous game, they didn't do super well stateside, so you can still find copies for a fair price. Most listings I found were around $30. And again, you can pick it up digitally on the PS3 store for $10. Those are the Digital Devil Saga games. They didn't do super well back in the day, but now they seem to be picking up a cult following within the fandom, and it's fairly easy to get a hold of. If you have the hardware to play it, I don't see a reason for not picking it up. Next is the Devil Survivor series. This series was released on the DS family of systems originally, and seems to fall in the footsteps of Majin Tensei just a little bit, as it also is a strategy RPG. The series plays like a traditional SRPG with Megaten elements sprinkled in. You'll move your units on a grid like you would in mini SRPGs, but when you enter battle, you're thrown into a turn-based system reminiscent of the press turn system. Speaking of battles, fusion is in this game, but though it has been simplified due to the game being an SRPG. Outside the battle, the game features a visual novel-style presentation for its story. It also has a time management system a la Persona that allows you to spend time with your party and side characters. The first game in the series, Devil Survivor, was released for the Nintendo DS back in 2009. 2 years later, in 2011, it received an enhanced remake for the 3DS in the form of Devil Survivor Overclock. This remake adds redone art, new demons, voice acting, and a demon compendium, and an extra day of story. If you want to get a hold of these games, you'll probably have a rough time. Copies of the original version of the game are running around $70 to $100. Overclocked runs about the same with multiple listings for $70. You can also pick it up digitally on the 3DS for $20. The second game, Devil Survivor 2, was released in 2012, bringing with it a lot of improvements that were in Overclock, such as more demons and the Demon Compendium, as well as a new fate system which mirrored the social link system from the Persona games. This game also has a pachinko machine and an anime. In 2005, the game received an enhanced re-release on the 3DS called Devil Survivor 2 Record Breaker. This version of the game features voice acting, an easy difficulty, a new character, and a new scenario that takes place after the base game. This game does feature DLC, but most of it is just grinding DLC with one or two exceptions. One adds more demons, while the other adds 3 characters from the light novel and anime series Durarara. This DLC was never released in the US for unknown reasons, but the data is still in the game and translated, so if you're comfortable with save editing, you can easily add them to your game. If you want to get a hold of the original Devil Survivor 2, a copy will run you $50 or so. The enhanced version running a little more at $60. If you prefer digital, you can get it from the Nintendo eStore for $20. Well, that's the Devil Survivor games. They've got a very loyal and a very loud, might I add, fan base. It's always asking for more, so if you're into strategy, definitely check them out. If not, well, those easy difficulties are there for a reason. There's no shame in using them, no matter what the gamer in your head says. Alright, now it's time to talk about the weird one-off games that sort of float around in a nebulous area. There's not a lot of these, so it won't take too long. First up is Gitin Megami Tensei, Tokyo Moko Chiroku, or Gigatin for short. It was first released for the NEC PC 9801 in 1997, and then for PCs in 1999. Gigatin is a bit of a weird game, as it allows your demons to equip weapons and armor, and also has a battle system that's closer to Final Fantasy than other Megaten games. But the game also features some firsts for the series, like demons being able to level up, and the Awakening event. The story proceeds like a classic SMT game. Bombs fall, everyone dies, demons happen. I won't go into detail for those of you who want to play or read the game for yourself. I will, however, forewarn you that the game can be pretty graphic. At the time, anyway. There's a lot of titties in this game, but Osei's boner is absent. The game does depict dismemberment and consumption of a character, and let's face it, that's this game's lasting legacy. The PC version of the game does have a few differences. A customizable interface, which let's face it, should be something that's stock in all games now, but isn't. New dungeon and HUD graphics, and redone music. And while we're on the topic, I have to say that I absolutely love the art style for the demons in this game. They're really cool. If you want to get a hold of this game, you'll probably have a rough time with copies running from $300 to $600. Though you can find a copy on Abandonware. There is a translation effort in progress by user at Snekimis, sorry for the pronunciation, though from what I can tell, it's not very far in production. Next game is Shin Megami Tensei Trading Card Summoner. This game was released for the Game Boy Color back in 2001, and that's it really. There's barely any info about this game in English on the internet, but from what I found, the game is a video game adaptation of the Shin Megami Tensei trading card game, which is a thing that existed. So going in depth on this would be going in depth on the card game rules, which is something I'm not particularly keen on since I don't really like card games. Sue me. If you want to get a hold of this game, it won't cost you that much. It runs around $15. Pro tip, buy it through Yahoo Japan auction instead of eBay. It's significantly cheaper. Apparently there was a fan translation in progress, but there haven't been any updates on that for years. Like I said, that didn't take very long. The end approaches. Alright, now we're moving into a weird section of games that aren't really Megaten games or are only tangentially related to the series but often come up in conversation around the games. So I thought I might as well cover them. I've been trying to keep my opinions on the down low in this video, but for this bit, I will let them out a bit and give my opinion if these games should be considered Megaten games or not. First up is Tokyo Mirage Session Sharp FE. Originally released on the Wii U in 2016, this game initially started with the title Shin Megami Tensei Cross Fire Emblem when it was announced in 2013, but the true form of the game wouldn't be seen until 2015 and the full title won't be revealed until later that year. While the game is a crossover between the two franchises, it definitely treads much closer to SMT than Fire Emblem, with the Fire Emblem characters and features sort of just stuck onto the game. That said, I should probably talk about the combat system. You've got your classic Megaten spells and items, but that's where the similarities end. Since the game doesn't use the press turn system, when you strike a weakness, you don't get an extra turn. Instead, you get follow-up attacks from the other party members called sessions. This feature doesn't feel that good early game, but once you get late game, you can chain like 20 sessions. It feels pretty great. The game did release DLC on the Wii U, with a majority of them being alternate costumes, and many of these didn't see US release. There was DLC that was intended to help grinding as well. The game received a port to the Nintendo Switch in 2020, bringing all the game's DLC with it, minus the ones that weren't released in America. They also released new costumes with the new port to coincide with new releases. If you want to get a copy of the Wii U version, it's fairly cheap, running around $20. If you want the Switch version, that'll cost you a little bit more at $60 for digital or physical. If you want my opinion, the game has a lot more Megaten blood than Fire Emblem, so I have no problem calling it a Megaten game. Next up is a weird one. Megaten X is a first-person hack-and-slash game originally released for the Dreamcast in 1999. The game is a little odd to look at, to say the least. It definitely has the SMT aesthetics, but the gameplay couldn't be further from the series. Later in 2003, a third-person remake of Megaten X was released on the PlayStation 2 in Japan and Europe called Megaten Shao. Rather than being in third person, there are a number of differences between the two games. Certain enemies will now get special intros, all the stage enemies' positions have been altered, and new cutscenes were added. If you want to get a hold of a copy of the English Dreamcast release, it's running around $60. European copies of Shao run about the same price. There's a digital release of Shao on the PS3 store exclusively in Europe, but it was delisted from the store in 2013. I'm honestly not sure how I feel about this being considered a Megaten game, since it doesn't have a lot of the staples of the series, but it also has the same edge. I think I'd be fine with saying that it exists in the universe, but isn't part of the series, if that makes sense. Next is Catherine. Catherine is a puzzle game that was originally released in 2011 for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and then later the PC. The game's gameplay is focused on climbing a tower of blocks before the floor falls out from under you. I don't know how to describe the gameplay without it sounds super boring, but trust me on this one, it's neat. Later in 2019, an enhanced re-release came out for the PS4 and Vita, and then eventually the Switch called Catherine Full Body. The remake adds a new love interest with 3 endings, an additional ending for each of the old love interests, as well as some Persona 5 themed DLC. If you want to get a hold of the original version of Catherine, both console versions and the PC version are around $20. The PS4 version of Full Body is about $25, an imported copy of the Vita version is around $60, and a Switch copy is a little more than a PS4 copy at $35. As for whether I consider this game a Megaten game or not, I don't really. Sure, it has some similar themes and references, but I don't think that's enough to land it in the series proper. That's it. I've covered every single Megaten game, with no exceptions whatsoever. Alright, I lied. There's one last series. Save the best series for last. It's time for the Jack series. In this series, there's no common theme, save one, Jack Frost. the mascot of the entire franchise. Just look at this little guy. Don't you want to forfeit all your earthly possessions to him? The first game in the Jak series is Jak Bros for the Virtual Boy, which was released in 1995. Fun fact, this was also the first Megaten game localized in America. This game is a dungeon crawler, but a bit different from the rest of the franchise. Instead of exploring a dungeon and fighting in an RPG manner, you explore the dungeon while dodging traps and collecting keys to get to the next floor before the timer runs out. If you want to acquire the best game in the franchise, a physical copy will cost you at the very least $100 or up to $1,000, which you should be willing to pay for Jak Frost. The Jak series has one other game, Shin Megami Tensei Synchronicity Prologue. Now looking at the title, you might ask, Alice, shouldn't this be in the Shin Megami Tensei section of the video? No! Look, you play as the funny guy. It was released back in 2017 as part of a marketing push for the currently releasing Shin Megami Tensei Strange Journey Redux. This game is a first for the series as it is a Metroidvania. If you want to play the game, you're in luck, as the game was released completely free. The only downside is that it was a limited release, but if you do some Googling, you're sure to find it. While once only released in Japanese, there's an English translation out there. So here we are at the end. I'll flash the numbers on screen because I'm not writing them down right now. Boy, that's a lot. But for real, it really seems like if you're getting into console Megaten games, grabbing a 3DS and a PS3 might be in your best interest, as long as the storefronts remain up. And they won't last forever. I would also want to give a big shout out to Kai-san on Reddit who made a huge master post of all Megaten properties and their translation status. I had already written the first draft of the script at the time, but it was super helpful on subsequent rewrites. Thanks again! But anyway, thanks for watching. Let me know if you're interested in me doing a video like this on the mobile games as well. I'll see you next month for a new video. Be sure to check out my Twitch and Twitter. Bye!